if you're producing a very large aircraft that's taking you 10 years, that's one thing. But if you're producing drones that are evolving every few months, right, it's supposed to cost, much, much, much cheaper than traditional, aerospace systems, you cannot win as a slow moving 100,000 person, large prime, right? And this is, I think, where the ecosystem, the customers are moving forward.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of DIB Innovators. Today I'm speaking with Bentzion Levinson, founder and CEO at HevenDrones. Ben, thanks for chatting today.
Hey, thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Oh, this is great. Super exciting. Love drone companies, love the capability sets you bring. And as you can see in Ukraine, obviously drones are beginning to reshape how we think about warfare. So this will be exciting. But before we get into that, can you share a little bit, your background? How did you get to the place where you're founding HevenDrones and the journey that got you there?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in New York, of all places. When I was 10 years old, my family picked up and moved to Israel, which was an experience of its own. I grew up, from 10 onwards in Israel. I was a combat commander in infantry in the IDF. And after my service, I volunteered for national projects in Israel. This actually goes to the border between Gaza and Israel. And this was when terrorists were sending fire kites and balloons from Gaza into Israel with the goal of setting Israel on fire. I know it sounds crazy, but this was unfortunately the reality. And what we're speaking to about a year plus since October 7th doesn't sound that crazy. But make a long story short, I got involved. I volunteered with a group that used drones at first to identify the fires. And we would then send the location of the fires to the firefighters so they can get there as fast as possible. We realized that by the time the firefighters would get there, the fires would spread. We said, hey, we got to kind of think of a better solution. And this led to a second solution, like a second version, where the drone was actually able to put out the fire. So we built a bit of a larger drone, same thermal camera to identify the fires. We actually started dropping these chemical material balls on the fire and literally able to extinguish the fire. So this was like a really interesting project. We said, hey, can we put out forest fires? The answer was really fast. Hey, in most forest fires, look at, California, Australia, elsewhere, it can take hours, if not days, to even identify the fires. So, putting them out with small drones is much more challenging. But what I realized through this project was that drones are going to be a significant part of the future. Now, as you said in the opening, today it's pretty common knowledge, right? Going back 7 years ago, that wasn't that clear. Drones were being used for niche use cases. They weren't really kind of this main technology that, you would think of defense tech equals drones, right? But what I realized is that drones really make sense because if you think about drones versus other capabilities on the ground or in the sea, the skies are basically open, right? Like obviously there are buildings in some places and there are, planes flying at, tens of thousands of feet, but there's so much that we can do if we use the skies efficiently. But if you look at the drone industry back then, and to some extent still today, drones are kind of in two separate categories: a small flying camera or flying sensor that's collecting information, or a very large UAV that's an unmanned plane costing tens of millions, right? And what I realized through this project, which led me to found HevenDrones, was that if we can make drones that can be flying robots, right? So they're seeing something, but also able to take action based on what they're seeing. This can lead to, and this can be a new generation of drones, where the drones are literally working as flying robots, different use cases, different industries, but essentially, doing something instead of just seeing something. So this is kind of how I got into HevenDrones. I wasn't a big kind of aviation person before this. I wasn't a big, I spent some time in the military, but I wasn't a big, kind of ex-general, obviously with my age. It was just kind of this thing that I volunteered for, and I realized that, the world is going to undergo significant changes. And it seems that if I can build out this technology, there might be something very big to be built here.
Well, that's great. And so you set off, and you found this, or did you begin the company?
Yeah, so I founded the company. So we were always a US kind of mindset company. I founded originally out of Israel with the understanding that the Israeli market is much smaller than the US. But the advantage is that because it's much smaller, it's much easier to penetrate the market, right? When you're starting off something, the most important thing is the ability to penetrate a market. And in the US and other markets where very large markets, it's really hard to get that penetration. You also want to get that really fast customer feedback, right, coming in. So Israel, unfortunately, is also, besides for the past year, traditionally needs to use this technology in the field, all the time. So these kind of two aspects led me to originally start operations in Israel. Until today, we have a very large operation in Israel. We are a US company. We have operations in the US, and kind of the US is our main long-term market. But we are a significant player in the Israeli drone market as well.
Okay, and so talk to me then about, what are you guys building and what are the technologies? Are you more of a software company, hardware company, combo?
Yeah. So what we're building is drones that can be flying robots, drones that can do things as I mentioned. What does it actually mean? So we have two separate product lines. One is heavy lifting. So focus on how can drones lift significant payloads and therefore do things in the battlefield or elsewhere. We are doing this company. Our current kind of max payload is 70 pounds, right? So 70-pound payload, that drone has about a 10-mile radius. So, right, working within areas within a battlefield, again, within, big mining area or things like that, right? On one hand, we're solving the heavy lift with 70 pounds of payload, but we're still flying, as I mentioned, for about 10 miles, which is the main limitation there. Our second line of product is really aimed to solve that long endurance as well as the heavy lift. And we realized that in order to solve heavy payloads, we have to solve the energy source because using traditional batteries just don't get us the distance. So we use hydrogen fuel cells, which I know sounds interesting, but it really makes sense. And it really, solves a lot of the challenges that drones have. We're able to go for about 10 hours of flight time, totally stealth flight. So the noise level is very, very low, thermal signature very, very low. And we're now scaling this up to about 50 pounds of payload.
And so talk to me about the hydrogen piece. I find that interesting, as you...
Yeah.
So how did you come to that? And what is...
Yeah. So we came to this from the need of the capabilities. As I said, if you look at traditional drones powered by batteries, the main limitation is the energy density and the flight time, right? So again, getting a multi-rotor version is getting, maybe up to an hour. And then if you have a wing, like a fixed wing, it's also maybe up to 3 hours maximum, right? But then they can't land. There's other challenges there. If you want to switch to combustion engine, which is the traditional way of powering long endurance drones, there's a lot of challenges there. The first and foremost is the noise level, right? Whether you're in defense or commercial, the noise level is just not sustainable. You cannot, have 100 aircraft flying around, sound like a flying, kind of this flying thing in the air that's making a ton of noise, right? That's not going to work. The second thing is the thermal signature, right? In the more advanced battlefields we're having today, the different challenges we have in the Pacific Ocean, in Europe, in the Middle East, there are, more advanced capabilities to take out drones, and therefore a drone that has a thermal signature will most likely, right, or there's a higher level of it getting shot out of the sky. And this is kind of what led us to hydrogen as the only source. Now, hydrogen, the main challenge with hydrogen is, first of all, the safety, right? Is it safe? People, tend to think about, other historic things around hydrogen. And the second piece is, all right, so let's say it makes sense. Where do I get the hydrogen from? Right? Like, where am I sourcing? I know how to source fuel. I know how to source electricity. Where am I sourcing hydrogen? So, those 2 points, if you dive into it, actually those 2 points, hydrogen has an advantage in them. In the safety piece, we tend to think of traditional batteries as safe, but they're really not that safe. We've all seen the videos of the Teslas, right, where the battery ignites and it's like impossible to put out that fire. So if a traditional drone, falls on the ground, starts a fire, it's really hard to put that out. It's really dangerous. Hydrogen is actually safer. And again, we've done testing, shooting it, dropping it, etc. If there is an explosion, it's kind of a split-second explosion that goes straight up, right? Because the hydrogen is lighter than the air. The second piece is the refueling, which is a great question. And the infrastructure question, the refueling of hydrogen in general is probably what's holding the broader hydrogen industry back, right? So, there are hydrogen cars and trucks, right? Technology is available. We don't see much of them, right? There's Toyota has a hydrogen car, and in California, you can buy it. There's 40 odd stations that you can refuel the car. But if you want to take a vacation from LA to Vegas, you can't drive back because you can't refuel it in Vegas, right? So those are the traditional challenges. In the case of drones, we're using a very small amount of hydrogen. We're using less than 1 pound of hydrogen per flight, which means that we only have to source a small amount of hydrogen. And we actually are able to solve this by having a portable refueling station that literally can create hydrogen wherever you are in the world, right? So it's a trailer-based solution. It sits in the back of your Humvee, right? Defense or commercial, pretty small. You can power it by solar on the roof, solar panels on the roof, and you're basically creating hydrogen wherever you are. Now, this, on one hand, solves where am I getting the hydrogen. It also tends to be an advantage because there's something called energy independence. Basically, the understanding that if there's a war today, let's say with China, the whole Pacific region or other places, where it's going to be hard to get our fuel sources into these locations, there's an issue of I can have the best F-35 or F-22, whatever is behind you in that picture there, right? If you can't fuel that thing, that's irrelevant, right? It's going to be staying, on the carrier on the ground, right? And in a case where China has hundreds of times the shipbuilding capacity of the U.S., it's not so clear that in the coming years, the U.S. will be able to get their tankers until where it's needed, right? So the fact that we're using hydrogen and hydrogen can be produced at the point of origin totally independent is actually a really interesting advantage that's getting more and more traction within the U.S. defense community, saying, hey, energy independence has to be a priority of its own. Obviously, it has to come with the aircraft that can do what's needed. And, flying 10 hours plus totally stealth is kind of what fits that in. But hydrogen really, we believe strongly, is the solution, for kind of almost anything going forward.
So in making that, are you basically just using electrolysis with water?
Yep.
Maybe you're just pulling in water and zipping it and splitting it,
Exactly.
packing it and going.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a micro electrolyzer. You have to have some energy source. You use solar, which is if you want to be energy independent. You can use other energy sources, but the solar, obviously, you can take wherever you are in the world. You just open up your panels. You take some water. The water can also be taken out of the air, right? You don't have to have, because they're very small amounts. And then we have the electrolyzer, and then we have a small thing that pressurizes it. So we're flying at 350 bar of pressure, which is relatively high. So we have to pressurize the hydrogen into our tanks. But all of this, like I said, is the size of a small trailer.
Fantastic.
And this one trailer is enough to power the drone for 24/7, right? So the amount of energy we're producing every 24 hours can keep us in the air with one drone for 24 hours.
How much water do you go through?
A small amount.
Like a gallon or?
Yeah. Again, it depends exactly what and how, but yeah, like really small amounts.
So like you said your drone carries 1 pound of hydrogen. So could you say how much? I'm just curious.
Yeah,
I mean, interesting. How much water would it be?
Right, I'd have to get back, like do the exact math. I don't have it on top of my head. But like really small amounts that's portable. Like I said, like we're now working on that. You can just take it out of the air, right?
Oh, that's
Kind of
fascinating.
like your own, like your own, like, just the ability to take it out of the air and then use it. So it's really, much easier and than it sounds.
Man, I think that would be a great advantage. You just think of the logistical challenges with, other than you got to drag a trailer around, but to be able to be someplace, once you get it there,
exactly. Like
continuous operations, you don't have to keep resupplying.
Exactly. Once it's there, that's it. And again, forever until it's, X years of life and maintenance, but like that's it. It's creating energy, right? And again, in today's world where, the energy sources are becoming much more important, look at the AI world, right? Like it used to be kind of the, the software, and then it became, the chips, the NVIDIA chips, and then it became the data centers. And now it's the energy that's powering that, right? People realize that without the energy, you can't get a significant data center, et cetera, right? So like energy, is really, really important. Again, think about battlefield, think about, our best technology, our carriers, our aircraft. That becomes really important.
So we'll get to the military use case here in a little bit, but are you seeing traction commercially, like commercial use cases? Being able to have a small drone that can carry, 70 pounds, I just think of all the things you can commercially do. So it's good delivery.
Yeah.
Are you finding a demand signal there?
Yeah. So there's a ton of use cases and a ton of demand signal from the customers. The main challenge with the commercial industry is the regulatory piece, right? So if you're defense, right, as long as you prove that thing is safe, you control your airspace, you control what to do. And the technology is there to control, multiple drones with one user sitting behind the screen, right? Like the technology is not the challenge. The challenge is, if you're sitting whichever city you're sitting, right, in New York, San Francisco, LA, or London, right, you're going to have thousands of drones above the skies. Who's responsible for, they're not crashing with each other, that whole kind of airspace piece, right? And that's become a big challenge. The FAA here in the US has really been pushing that, and it will happen, I would say, in the coming years. But it's still a challenge where if you look at the economics of scaling out drone operations, you really have to have, or it really makes sense when you have one operator managing multiple drones going long distances, right? So we're starting off as use cases that, for example, we're not flying over people. So, the industrial use cases, the power lines, the mining and, offshore, things like that. So I would say it's moving slower than I expected, 5-6 years ago when I founded the company, but it's definitely moving forward fast. What has changed dramatically is the defense industry, where, like I said, like 5-6 years ago, drones were being used and there was a need for drones, but it was these niche use cases. What's happening today, whether we realize it or not, this is an important thing, right? Like whether we're thinking about this or not, we're looking at what's happening in the world, in Europe, right? In the Middle East with Iran and all of its proxies in Israel and China. We're living in an era of drone war, right? Hamas opened up its attacks on October 7th using drones, right? That dropped a small RPG head and took out Israel's cameras. Israel could not see because of small drones, right? In China, DJI is producing, the rumor is, hundreds of thousands. I heard 200,000 drones per month, right? DJI is controlled by the government. These can all be armed drones like this, right? And they could probably scale from 200 a month to 500 to 1 million drones a month. So we're in an era, right, where drones are being used, Ukraine, Russia, right? It's basically a drone war, right? So we're in an era where drones are a significant part of this. I think what's happening is that the customers, right? So the DoD customers, first and foremost, but also the broader ecosystem of suppliers, of investors, are all realizing that there's a real opportunity to create significant companies in this space because it's kind of been neglected, right? The big five primes and again, great companies, but they're really not equipped. They're great for producing, we can discuss this, but if you're producing a very large aircraft that's taking you 10 years, that's one thing. But if you're producing drones that are evolving every few months, right, it's supposed to cost, much, much, much cheaper than traditional, aerospace systems, you cannot win as a slow moving 100,000 person, large prime, right? And this is, I think, where the ecosystem, the customers are moving forward. In the US, again, a lot of interest, DIU, Replicator, all these programs we're all hearing. It will take some time probably for them to materialize because there's really a change of there's a whole change of how things are being done. And rightly, this takes time to move a big ship like the US government. But we're seeing, governments around the world really adapting to this new reality.
Yeah, it's a true asymmetric change in the battle space. It's,
yeah.
And
unfortunately, the US and other kind of more advanced countries, I think, fell behind because we always thought that we had the edge with the traditional aircraft, right? And if you look at, Ukraine, the reason I think Ukraine has been so advanced is because Ukraine had a disadvantage against Russia, right? So they had to kind of start pulling the rabbits out of their hat. And, the drone, if you think about a $5,000, $500 drone, taking out a $5 million tank, right? And then not only that, but doing it in, hitting every 10 tanks as part of, kind of a large entourage. And then, it's not five, it's actually $50 million of tanks are now irrelevant for, in a $5,000 drone. And it's scaling this out, right? They've been hitting the propellers of helicopters, right? Taking a small drone and going exactly into that propeller and downing a helicopter, right? This is really crazy. But then the challenge and the big for that is also our enemies are doing the same, right? So again, the whole Iranian, Hezbollah, Houthi, Hamas, they're all trying to get an advantage over Israel, over the US by using this, cheap technology. And again, I think what's happening in China, we're all seeing is right. It's pretty scary.
Yeah. And it's only a matter of time until those ranges increase, the size increase, capabilities. Yeah. Where do you see that going in your own mind? Let's use hydrogen. What is your goals? Is range an issue? Because 10 miles isn't great.
Yeah. So also going to clarify, our traditional heavy lifter, the first one I mentioned, is not flying with hydrogen. That's flying with battery, right?
Okay.
With hydrogen, we're flying for about 10 hours, about 1,000 kilometers, about 600 miles. We can expand that if needed. Basically, fly with a bit less payload and longer range. But our classic range is about 600 miles, 1,000 kilometers.
Wow.
Yeah, and important to know that we're flying totally stealth, right? So you're flying under the radar where you can't see or hear, the drone again physically or by thermal signature. And if you imagine scaling these things up, having hundreds or thousands of these, each one doing different missions, this really, brings a new era of how to do things.
Yeah, and how about talking about, obviously kind of control with that's challenge, and there's challenges with that, and there are signals coming from that. So I would say totally stealth. How are you working communicating? Are you going through SATCOM, or do you have multiple different, ways you can just add, components on it?
Yeah, so it's a great point. So, one of the things that we've had, so we have significant operation in Israel. We're the leading supplier of heavy lift. We're the sole source. We have a sole source contract for hydrogen-powered drones. And again, unfortunately for Israel, and the past year has been a very tough year, but because of the necessity, right? Israel's really been innovating, and we've been fortunate to go through multiple, innovation cycles of how do you make sure the systems actually work in the field. And important to note, in the technology pace, the adversaries are actually changing the way they try to take down drones at a similar pace, right? So it's not saying, hey, this drone works, period, but this drone worked. They're now using other ways to block SATCOM or whatever it's going to be. Let's try to find other ways. So that's been really interesting. The whole world of navigation and communication, right, have been really critical because you can have the best drone in the world. If you can't speak to it or the drone doesn't know where it is, it can't do its mission. It's irrelevant. There's kind of two approaches here. The main overall approach is autonomy, right? So as these systems become more autonomous, they can do their missions essentially on their own. The need for outside communication goes down. Now, to get to a point where the drone can do its mission by itself without any outside intervention, it's also kind of a philosophical question of hey, are we going to allow the drone? Let's say the drone can identify a target, right? Hey, this white Toyota pickup truck is what the ISIS uses, right? As long as you see it, you can take it out, right? Are we going to let it do that or not? So that's a question. But we're obviously, we're allowing it to do a lot more on its own than than needing to kind of control every way of the flight path. So that's a good part. What's kind of the broader solution, though, has to include multiple ways of communication and navigation, right? Like just having, one, whether it's RF, whether it's SATCOM, whether it's LTE, one way isn't enough because it can be jammed. So that's why we've been working on like having multiple different kinds of solutions, both for navigation and for communication, that essentially make sure our systems work no matter what. Right. So again, SATCOM is a big part of that. Starlink is becoming increasingly more interesting, as a great solution that's really hard to jam. And complement that with other solutions. It also depends where you're flying. So again, if you're flying over the ocean, right, then both the navigation and the communication become more challenging because you can't do navigation based on vision, really, because you're seeing the same ocean, right? And you can't use LTE, RF is much more complicated with the distances. So, depending on where you are, things change, but essentially it's having a broad base of options and capabilities and then picking based on the scenario, which one you're actually activating and using.
Yeah, that's good. How about, are you developing your own software for these, for navigation and the missions, or are you outsourcing that?
Yeah.
And how are you incorporating AI into this?
Yeah, great question. So we are focused on developing the best systems, the best aircraft possible, right? And that's really where our focus goes. We have a software team, we have an AI team, but they're really focused on the system level of the aircraft, and very often using other partners, right? There's a couple of reasons why we like to use partners. Number one is just the time to market. Like we believe that now is the time. It's happening. As I mentioned, like it's happening now, whether we like it or not, whether we're aware of it or not, whether we admit it or not. It's happening now, and therefore we want to get our drones to more and more customers as fast as possible. So we just want to use the best technology out there and incorporate that in the system. The other reason is that aircraft it's a tough business, right? Imagine the plane. The last time you flew a plane, like you want to make sure this is as safe as possible. So we try to also incorporate like the best systems in the market that already have the credibility with the end users and with the customers. They've been proven in the field, and then adding that to our aircraft to just lower the risk level from the customer's perspective, like to make sure that they really are getting the best aircraft to lower risk as possible. But our team does incorporate the different types of software and AI into the aircraft. AI is relevant for a lot of different use cases. There's kind of three main uses. One is the aircraft itself, right? So things like maintenance, preventive maintenance, right? Things like that that you want to have, again, as smart of a system as possible. The second one is more related to the flight path, right? So how do you're going to be taking the best flight path, detecting and avoiding different challenges, etc. The third one goes to the use case, right? So if your mission is to take out enemy from the drone or do other things from the drone, you want to make sure that that use case, again, you're launching whatever you're launching from the best location, right? So that's already around the use case. So it's kind of three different levels of AI. Like I said, we don't develop the AI necessarily ourselves. We definitely work on incorporating it with the best partners in the system itself.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It's a crazy world that we live in, right? If we think about,
yeah.
And think about the past 2 years in AI, ChatGPT launched, that whole, like, imagine, like you would design a system 3 years ago that would include ChatGPT type technologies. Like, you're totally irrelevant today, right? So like we always try to kind of stay that cutting edge and make sure that we're really incorporating the best technology possible. And that goes back to time to market and iterations, right? Like if you want to stay the best product in the market, you have to be always continuously iterating and making sure you really are the best with the best technology out there.
Yeah, and to take on the AI challenge itself, I mean, there's companies putting billions of dollars into that.
Exactly.
But if you have the right partners that can harness that technology into your use cases, that makes complete sense. 2 questions just to help me, help folks understand. How big are you guys, employee-wise?
Yeah, so we're about 50 employees today, split mostly between the U.S. and Israel.
And what are your drones made out of? What is your primary material?
Yeah. So we're mostly using composites, mostly carbon fiber. Obviously the challenge with drones is lightweight, but very, very strong, right? That's the traditional challenge. So we're using mostly carbon fiber and composites.
Okay. And so when you look at innovation, since you're not dealing with the software or ways to, identify threats and move or target identification, that's being incorporated through partners. Where do you see most of the innovation occurring? And what have you seen like over the last year with the Ukraine thing? And maybe the Israel, attack you talked about those innovations. Where are the innovations then within your platforms, if you will?
Yeah. So there's 2 levels here, right? And it all goes around systems and solution. So our main focus is designing the best aircraft possible for our needs. So I'll give you an example. it sounds pretty straightforward to take a hydrogen fuel cell and hydrogen tank and just replace your batteries or your combustion engine, right? The answer is that doesn't really work efficiently. If you want to get a great drone, you have to really design it around the hydrogen, around the energy source, right? It's kind of similar to what Tesla did back in the day, where it didn't just try to take a battery and put it into a regular car. It designed the car to be fit for working with batteries, right? So we've been doing a lot of work around that. Now, even in the software space, we do a lot of work of, again, designing the aircraft for autonomy and even incorporating the different softwares and stuff. So it's a lot around the system. If you look at what's the big gap, right, it's really around making the best systems that actually work in the field. The second piece is around solutions. And this goes back to the whole thing about, Ukraine and more specifically for us, the Israel experience. Having a drone that works in the range is one thing, and that's great. Right, having a drone that works in the field when there's all the different threats in EW, et cetera, and actually solving customer needs is a different level, right? And taking the platforms that we developed and incorporating all the different technology, the different use cases, the different payloads into something that actually works for a customer in the field with all the different, ConOps, the concept operations and stuff like that. That is what we're focused on. That's where we see the real value, right? Because there's so many technologies out in the world, and it's always hard to, again, there are technology you can have, a specific patent to be the best. We obviously have a lot of patents in the company, but it's essentially around curating the best systems and then incorporating them into the best solutions and actually working in the field. Many, big US companies that are worth billions of dollars, and this is public knowledge, when the war in Ukraine started and their technology was sent to Ukraine, they were outbeaten by these, $500 small drones because they were kind of working to solve solutions with the end users, right? So the systems of the future are really going to be around amazing systems that are turned to amazing solutions. And you have to have all the crazy technology in the world available today, but also has to be incorporated in the best way that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's a travesty of what's happened, around the world, but for a company like yours to be able to, have that test bed where you're solving problems, but also be able to iterate quickly and bring new solutions is a very unique opportunity in the time of the world, I would think.
For sure. Yeah, no, for sure. And again, I think the good thing is that the world, I think, is waking up to the fact that we're in a new era. And, I think the US, and again, the US, fortunately hasn't really had direct attack via drones, at scale on kind of poor U.S. homelands. Hopefully, we won't have to get there to get the message, right? Like, hopefully, we can learn from what's happening around the world, take those lessons, and I think we are, but just take those lessons learned and make sure that again we're ready for the next challenges that might come whenever, right? Like, you never know,
Absolutely.
when these war break out. If you look at history, like wars, tend to break out, in very specific events. It's really hard to anticipate. And, one thing leads, it's like this very large snowball, right? Like, imagine it's a Chinese, captain, the sea that decides that, he just wants he's annoyed with this, US ship and just wants this, or a Filipino ship and wants to just shoot something at it, right? And, one guy happens to get killed and all of a sudden can find himself in, a huge war and no one even necessarily intended it, right? Et cetera. So I think it's important to always stay ahead of the technology even before, it seems like it's there.
Yeah, and I know from just my Air Force experience and the planning at the senior levels, because it's so new, it's hard to really figure out, because we have been a military of, platforms.
Yeah.
And they're trying to change the capabilities, but this drone scenario is really making people question things. And so it's very interesting from what you're doing to even, this unmanned CCA concept of wingman to hypersonic, different platforms. It's a fascinating, time to be in your space, I'm sure. Well, that's good. So what are right now, if you can talk about it, especially maybe over in Israel, are you primarily carrying, are you doing the sensor and weapon together? And is that what's being used from an offensive perspective, or is it more intelligence gathering? Like, where do you find Israel is using your drone, to bring the best capability forward?
Yeah. So our whole mission is to be actionable, right? So to be able to take action based on what we're seeing. There's two or three main use cases. One is logistics. So moving things around, we tend to think of logistics as something that's a given and easy, but in battlefields, especially ones that, are challenging, being able to move things around longer distances, larger payloads is really important. That's kind of the first one. The second one is acting as a mothership. So you mentioned a lot of other capabilities in the broader drone world. There's a broader unmanned system world. We use our drones to deploy other systems. These can be robots on the ground that have a hard time going over water or a border or to a rooftop. These can be small kamikaze drones, different capabilities from a large drone. And that's like a really interesting thing to think about. Like, where is the world going? We're going to have, kind of platoons of, hundreds of thousands of unmanned systems working together, speaking with each other, comms, relay, etc. So that's interesting.
So when you say that, are you using like unmanned ground vehicles, so UGVs, and dropping UGVs places?
Exactly. So yeah, so we basically have we have a drone that can launch a UGV on the ground, but can also launch a smaller drone, a kamikaze drone from the rooftop, right? And basically working as a mothership, we're working as comms relay for these different systems, right? To make these systems cheaper, higher level of ability to work in different distances. So that's kind of a really interesting use case that we're already doing, and it's scaling as as things are getting more, again, as robots, unmanned systems are becoming more used. The third thing is really using them as the ability to launch things, right? To launch and drop things. If we think about again, one of the greatest use cases, and I can't get into too much detail, but just let everyone use their imagination, democratizing air support in the fact where traditionally, if you're in infantry and you identify a threat, and right now you can use drones to identify threats miles away before you have to endanger your own troops, right? The question is, what do you do about it? So you usually call in air support, like yourself, right? As an Air Force pilot, whatever, right? Or, UAVs or whatever, right? Or large helicopters, right? The challenge is that these are very, very expensive systems. These systems usually are scarce resources, right? So usually if there's 100 battles going on at once, usually there aren't 100 planes available to do air support. And lastly, if you're a commander in the field, infantry, right? You want to be able to control when and how you attack that, right? So drones that can, take significant payloads, and again, including munitions, and launch them very effectively has been, I think, a significant part of how warfare is changing. I can't get into much details beyond that, but again, whether it's carrying things, launching things, or being a mothership, these have all been, scaled out in the field.
And proven in combat.
Yeah.
That's crazy. How heavy are your drones and size? Can you give just with your hands or?
Yeah, so the drone itself tends to weigh about double its payload. So if we're lifting 70 pounds, the drone tends to weigh a bit more than 70 pounds, right? So we're kind of like basically similar to our self-load, the payload. The hydrogen systems are a bit more expensive. We have a bit more overhead and the tank and a fuel cell. Now, these, again, our drones go, are a few feet, right, when they're open. So we have two versions of drones. One is a multi-rotor, right? That's like a 10-mile one. And that opens up to between 6 and 8 feet, depending on which model we have. And then we have drones that also have a wing, so they can take off from anywhere where they can fly forward, and they get to about 14, 15 feet in wingspan from tip to tip.
Okay.
So yeah, they're definitely not the small drones you take in your, what I'm saying, like you kind of like take in your backpack, right? On the other hand, we're talking about, hundreds and even 1,000 kilometers in distance, and the ability to really use these to launch different things, right? So it's kind of a new way of aircraft. What we are very focused on is that all our systems can fold into a Pelican case, right? And think about up to 5 minutes, maximum to put together. So like they are very, very transportable, which is important. These aren't helicopters you got to flying around and stuff. You just put them in the Pelican case and take them out.
That's great. So are you seeing demand signal from Ukraine and other countries that are trying to get a hold of this technology? And what's your philosophy of who you sell to?
Yeah. So there's demand signals from around the world. I think what's interesting, when the war in Ukraine broke out two and a half years ago, obviously Ukraine was the main customer in general, looking at drones, et cetera. Now it's Ukraine kind of used up their budget, right? The US is obviously helping them, but like all the countries around Ukraine, the whole kind of Europe and Eastern Europe, the whole, I think Germany, I think, doubled its budget or something. Like there's a lot of, and people are realizing that a big part of this has to go into drones. Again, other countries around the Pacific, right? The Pacific kind of region, obviously the US, but also the Philippines and other countries there, Australia. So there's a lot of, kind of countries realizing that both in this fortunate, situation in the world today, where war can break out from many places, many different times, we have to get ahead of the game, but also in the fact that, because we're in a new era of drone autonomous systems, AI, there's really a need to shift that capability. Regarding the philosophy, so drones, depending which size, but because our drones are more advanced, we are controlled by export licenses. So essentially the governments, right, US, Israel, they tend to decide who we can sell to, who we not sell to. So we didn't have that much philosophy. Again, in general, I think there's a pretty clear line in the world between the good side and the bad side. Right, the free world and the world that's fighting that, led by Iran, I think is the first and foremost threat. Russia, China, North Korea, and they're all working together, right, with technology. in Israel's last attack on Iran, took out the, S-300, right? The Russian anti-aircraft vehicle, right? So, all of a sudden, Russia and Iran are very tight to each other. Obviously, China is very connected to that kind of group. So, obviously, we're in the, the good side against the bad side. So there's kind of a pretty clear line that we see against, who's on which side. But like I said, export licenses, kind of tend to lead the way to what we can do and how we can do it.
Talk to me, do you have a lot of competition? I mean, there's drone companies are popping up everywhere.
Yep.
What is your, you'd say your biggest differentiator and reason that folks are sticking with you?
Yeah. So, drone companies are coming up, like you said, they're like mushrooms left and right. Most people are focusing on what I call the easier challenges, the more traditional challenges of either small kamikaze drones, small drones like, the DJI equivalent drones are just flying around, flying cameras, and different kind of versions of those. The both heavy payload and the long endurance, the two areas that we're really focused on, you'd be surprised, but there aren't any solutions, right? Like in Israel, we are the only mil-spec solution. It's heavy lift. We have a sole source contract for hydrogen. So like we really are a unique player. And obviously Israel's, it's not the US, it's a smaller market, but there aren't that many technologies out there. But we have a few things that really go for us. First and foremost, technology. I think the hydrogen is really a game changer. Like I said, if you're looking at, the challenges, Pacific region, the combination of, flying stealth, long endurance, and being energy independent, like hydrogen is the only way. And we've been, market leader here for the past, 3-4 years. The additional aspects is the fact that we're actually proven in the field, right? So many companies talk about what they do, or we actually are proven in the field with customers. So that can put us at a different level of other companies. The last thing I think is really important is the payload modularity. So we have a lot of partners around the world, and we don't really make the payloads of the drone. We make the best platforms. We spoke about platforms. And our strategy is that finding the best partners in the world that focus on whether it's ammunition, a sensor, a UGV, a kamikaze drone, a special mechanism for dropping logistic payloads. I mean, we partner with these companies. So it's kind of like the App Store strategy, which is like if you have the best iPhone, and then you start creating the App Store, people want to work with you. And then once the customers have your drone, then if they want to do something else with 70 pounds, it's much easier for them, right? They already bought a drone, they train their people on it, they have the supply chain for, spare parts, etc. It's much easier to just add a new payload to that current drone than buying a new system, right? So, the time to market, the fact that we're battlefield proven in our strategy around payloads and our technology is, I think, what's actually giving us in the field, this first movers advantage and practical advantage. And we're obviously investing heavily and continuing to push this forward, understanding that there will be a lot of companies out there and, technology, there's always different cool technologies. Staying ahead of the curve and always having the best technology that actually works in the field and just getting that out to more and more customers is what's going to allow the leading company in the space, which will hopefully will be one of them, to stay at the head and actually win this game of, again, this future industry, right, of drones.
It's a fascinating pivot. So I've done this podcast, talking with another company that was in space. And so their focus was building, they call it the bus, but it's basically like the platform that can integrate with everything. Whereas I'd say more legacy companies are trying to vertically integrate everything, and they end up trying to do everything and probably aren't good at anything. So it seems like there is a shift.
It's not only that it's not good at it, it's that their systems are a lot more expensive, take a lot more time to develop, and it leads to less innovation in the market. There's something in the U.S. Defense community called MOSA, basically the new modular kind of design criteria. And the US DoD is trying to pull away from legacy systems and legacy program of records, again, where you buy one system for 7-10 years and that's it, into saying, hey, this is the platform, this is the software, this is the AI, this is the communication, etc. We want to be able to plug and play as we move forward. So if someone comes with a new platform, why shouldn't we just change the platform out, right? If someone comes with a new communication that can work much cheaper, much better, whatever, Starlink or whatever it is, why do we have to wait 70 years for a new program of record, right? So this is actively happening with all the innovation groups within the DoD community. So I do think that we're in it's in a new era. I do think that the primes have a disadvantage here, and there's going to be a lot of space for, young, small and growing startups to really innovate around one thing specific, again, the best platforms, the best communication, the best AI, and then really make sure that they continue to have this leadership position, the best position, and then work with the other companies to develop the best solution, the best platforms.
Yeah, I love it. Talk to me about your approach with your employees within your company on how to stay innovative.
Yeah, so I do think it starts with the people. Any organization is as good as the people it has, right? Even technology, if you think about technology, technology is only as good as what you can do with that technology, right? So people are key. I personally spend a lot of time focusing on a leadership team and hiring. Like it's a big part of my time because I believe that if I can find the best people to lead, the best executives in the company, and then they can do the work, then this is the best way to scale a company. So we're fortunate to have a very significant leadership team, people with experience throughout different industries, both defense and commercial, different countries at scale. I think how we stay ahead is really making it a goal, right? So if you're cognitive about the fact that you're in a space that will be changing every few months, and part of winning is surviving, and part of surviving is making sure that literally every few months you're staying ahead, or all the time you're staying ahead of the curve, and you have to integrate. It's like basically never stop, right? It's like, oh, the F-35 is developed, right? It's like, no, it's like, this is my starting point. I'm delivering to customers. I'm always going to, combine between the feedback from customers and the technology that's being developed and make it better literally all the time, right? It's like an iterative process. So I think it's having the best people, and it's having the best, the mindset that enables you to win in the game of innovation.
Yeah, no, people matter. What do they matter?
Yep.
So where do you see yourself, and what's your roadmap look like? And obviously you're getting, I would say, quick OODA loop or quick cycles on innovation for your current platforms. But do you have any big roadmap items or visions in 5 years where you're going to be as a company, what you're delivering? Like, what are your big goals for that?
Yeah, so there's kind of two main areas that we're growing in. One is the technology of the platforms, right? So getting into more capabilities, larger payloads, and longer distances, right? And the second thing is the different use cases, right? So growing to more and more markets, essentially taking our platforms and enabling more solutions to come from that, right? And if you think about it, essentially there's endless amount of payloads and use cases that you can do. And as the world is advancing, right, people just want to do more and more things with drones. So these are kind of two significant growth areas that we see for the company. We have a saying in the company that whoever's going to win the next 2 years will win the next 2 decades. And it's a very pressuring thing to feel on your shoulders, but like if you think about it, we're in an era where the market leaders are being created now, and we're really trying to do our best to push fast and be one of those leaders. We have different types of growth strategies. Growing kind of at really, again, fast speed, different locations, through joint ventures, through buying companies. Like we have different strategies that we've been implementing to grow and essentially create what we want to be the market leader in this space. We call actionable drones, right? So it's not a small flying camera, not a large UAV. It's probably that 10 to 100 pound space, right? It might kind of expand a bit, but that's kind of really the space. And again, 10-hour plus of flight time and the technology needed to support these efforts at scale.
Yeah, this is so great.
Understand and done, right? Don't get me wrong.
Well, are you guys, are you, I mean, wrap it up, but I want to keep talking. Are you venture backed? Is that how you've been able to scale and move forward? Or
so we've been backed by mostly significant family offices that are essentially investing their own money versus venture backed. So 5-6 years ago, the venture world was a lot less excited about defense tech and dual use and hardware than it is today. So we built a strategy in bringing on board a few very, very significant family offices that both are investing their own capital, so it's much more flexible, and also they can scale pretty fast. So we're fortunate to raise a lot of money to date. We are continuing to scale, and we are planning to launch a big funding round next year that will be kind of in the venture institutional round world, as we're kind of going to the hundreds plus million, larger scale. But we're fortunate to have amazing backers that believe in the mission of the company and have the ability to really back us at scale. So it's been exciting. We're obviously, like I said, we're 5+ years in. I think we're, really at the beginning of the game. I want to see the world full of drones. Again, the world's going to be full of drones. Hopefully the Western world led by the US, so for our drones are the ones that are better, stronger, more capable, and therefore winning this new era. But I do think that in the years to come, decades to come, we're going to see a total shift in how life looks on this kind of drones.
I couldn't agree more. Well, thanks, Ben. This has been great.
My pleasure.
Want to keep doing it. So maybe when you get to, after big funding, we'll have you back on again. We can talk about what it's
I love
like,
that.
what you can do.
Awesome.
But if folks want to follow you, fascinating mission and company, how best do they do that?
Yeah, so HevenDrones, we have a website, HevenDrones.com.
And that's HEVEN.
Correct, without the A. Correct. It's a good one. And then, LinkedIn, X, Twitter, like Google, you can find us.
Yeah.
If you want, you can find us. We're not hiding.
That's great. Hey, well,
Yeah.
I've learned a lot. Super excited for you guys. You got a fan here. So I wish you the best.
It was a good conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, let's stay in touch. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, David.